All right, let's get the zoom in going here. Second to last lecture for U.S. history this year, huh? The origins of the War on Terror. War on Terror is super important to our daily lives because, as I told you way back when on 9/11, basically your entire life for you guys, since you're a lot younger than me, has been during the War on Terror. I've also taught you this year numerous times that our Supreme Court, that our government has said that you can have some of your basic rights stripped away when the country is at war. And those two things overlap all the time. We talk contemporarily, right now, we talk in the right now about how much money should be spent on what. One of the main things that we spend money on is the War on Terror. This affects spending on things for you like school or road repair, right? We haven't been maintaining our roads very well in America for a long time, or bridges and stuff like that, and they're competing interests. What are we going to spend more on? Drones? Or are we going to spend more on school? We're going to spend more on roads. So these things all overlap in your life, and that's not even to mention things like the Patriot Act, which we will talk a lot about when I talk to you about Bush and Obama here in the next and the last lecture that we're going to have. But focusing laser-like on terrorism, okay, the War on Terror. So a little bit of background to this that's important while I adjust the camera is our support of Israel. We talked about Israel and the founding of Israel and some of that with the Holocaust lecture, but Israel gets created through a partitioning agreement by the United Nations in 1947. So that land had been controlled by Arab people, mostly, for most of history, right? It's in the Middle East. But England came to own it after World War I, and they had talked about splitting it in half to create an Israel and a Palestine, and it was controversial, and there were lots of fights, so they didn't do it. They held on to the land for 30 more years, and they gave it to the UN, and the UN partitioned it to create an Israel. Super controversial still, right? It was controversial then, it was controversial now. Multiple people had claims to that land, right? Jews claimed it because Israel is an important part of the Jewish faith, but it's also an important part to the Muslim faith and to the Christian faith. So a lot of people claimed that area, not to mention the fact that there were people living there. So it is a controversial deal. And an important part of this that we have up there is that Arab nations, right? So Middle Eastern nations, right, that are controlled by Arab people, saw it as Western meddling. That the United States, that England, that the United Nations, which is basically at this point, or right as it gets created, controlled by Western countries, are coming in and splitting up the Middle East and saying this is how it's going to be, and that made people very angry. Okay, one thing we'll note in world history is that people get very angry when they feel like outside countries are making their decisions for them. Anyways, the U.S. is going to back Israel through all the conflicts that it's in. Okay, there's immediately a war when Israel gets created. There'll be the Six-Day War about 15 years later, the Yom Kippur War 6 years after that. Israeli invasions of Lebanon, they invaded Lebanon twice. The first and second Palestinian intifadas, and the current fighting between Israelis and Palestinians. Every single time we've been on Israel's side because we value Israel as a strategic ally in the region, but at the same time, while we are supporting them, and my April security report is ready, while we support them, it just further makes those Arab nations that were mad at us further mad, right? They continue to get mad. So through all these wars, Israel has increased its territory beyond its initial borders. We have provided them with aid, military equipment, and support, and it is still very controversial. I'm going to go up here and fix this. All right, so our support for Israel is still controversial. Obviously, there's countries that, a lot of countries, honestly, that don't particularly love Israel in the region because they feel like they are getting too powerful. So, controversial. All right, Cold War, more background stuff, okay? Part of issues in the Middle East is the fact that the Soviet Union and the United States needed oil for their economies to function, okay? Remember, we're back in 1945 now, the war's over, and now it's a fight between the United States and the Soviets to become the most powerful country on earth. So we're going to pick and choose countries in the Middle East to support. Okay? The U.S. is going to support Israel, which we just talked about. We're going to support Saudi Arabia to the hilt, right? Still do, even though they do bad things. And we're going to stay friendly with Iraq. The Soviets are going to support other Arab nations such as Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iran. And we can see to this day, America is still very big allies with Israel and Saudi Arabia. and mostly with Iraq. Russia is still pretty big allies with Syria, Jordan, Iran, and for the most part still with Egypt. So those lines that were drawn all the way back then are still sort of around. But to make things a little easier for you, here's a big map, right? So right there in the dead middle is Iraq, right? Obviously we know that we are involved in Iraq, right, for the last 17 years now. Below them is Saudi Arabia, the big yellow country. Okay, we're heavily involved with Saudi Arabia. They're one of our biggest allies. Beneath Saudi Arabia, you see that brown-colored country on the map, is Yemen. We're supporting Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen, 700,000 children at risk of developing cholera in the next decade as we support that, which is gross. Next to Iraq up there, still green, but a different color green, is Iran, right? A hot-button area where we don't particularly like their leadership, and there's been a lot of issues between us and Iran throughout history, including the overthrow of their government in 53, the Iran hostage crisis in 79 and 80, the Iran-Contra affair of the 80s, and further like sanctions and stuff that we're still doing to this day, the Iran nuclear deal and all that. Next to Iran there, you can barely see in yellow, is Afghanistan, which we're going to talk about a lot. Israel we've talked about. Okay, so we look at Iraq. To the left of Iraq in orange is Jordan. Next to Jordan in kind of purplish red is Israel right there. All right, so first question on our War on Terror lecture. Starting after World War II, going through the Cold War and up to today, the United States supported which two Middle Eastern countries the strongest? A, Israel, B, Saudi Arabia, C, Jordan, or D, Iran? All right. Next. So let's focus on Afghanistan, right? We'll get a little bit more into Afghanistan right now. So, the Soviet Union will invade Afghanistan in 1979 to support the communist government that was there under attack. Okay, so the Soviets nominally controlled Afghanistan prior to 79, right? They had supported a communist government there, but some Afghanis did not enjoy living under communism. Some wanted to return or move towards a more Islamic-style republic. And also some of them didn't like communism because we kind of pushed them to dislike it a lot. Okay, so we are going to help engineer this invasion, right? We're going to arm Afghani rebels. Okay, we're generally going to send those weapons through Pakistan. We're going to do that, and we're going to convince those Afghani rebels to shoot at Soviet soldiers to get the Soviets to invade. We did that because we wanted to bleed them dry. We thought if they had their own Vietnam that it would hurt them a lot, right? And so we wanted Afghanistan to be their Vietnam. The National Security Advisor to President Carter at this point, his name was Brzezinski, he admitted as much, right? He said, what's more dangerous, international communism and the Soviet Union or a bunch of angry Middle Easterners? And as history will prove out, that wasn't maybe the greatest of statements. So the population in general will resist. What we call the opposition forces in Afghanistan became known as the Mujahideen. Now, the Mujahideen were not organized. It wasn't like one army wearing the same sort of color. It was a bunch of different groups that were all fighting against the Soviets, but we just collectively call them the Mujahideen. So the United States and Pakistan will send CIA and intelligence officers to train the rebels in terror tactics and guerrilla warfare. We will funnel tons and tons of weapons through Pakistan to try to keep our arms clean. However, Pakistan and our CIA are going to favor the most extreme members of the Mujahideen, the most extreme groups, because the most extreme groups did the best fighting. So, who's going to get the most weapons? Extremists. Who's going to get least? The moderates. And when this all falls apart, we'll talk about here in a minute, the extremists are going to take out the moderates. Anyways, the Soviets will be there all the way until 1988 when they pull out. Okay, one of the best, or I should say most effective Mujahideen fighters during this time period will be Osama bin Laden. Okay, Osama bin Laden, a rich Saudi Arabian. His father owned a super lucrative construction company, did a lot of work for the Saudi royal family, so they had a lot of money. He will join the call from Afghanistan to join in a religious war against the Soviets. Like I said, a lot of these Mujahideen fighters were extremists, and they will put out a call to other extremists to come and fight with them. Osama bin Laden will answer that call. He will receive direct training from CIA operatives. In fact, he'll travel to America at one point and meet some of our higher-up leadership. He was an ally to us in this fight, but that won't last long. So, the US CIA armed and trained Mujahideen in Afghanistan, including Osama bin Laden. Is that true or is that false? So, back to Afghanistan. The Mujahideen faction started fighting each other once the Soviets leave, right? So, the Soviets leave in 1988. Now, who's in charge of the country? Well, it's going to be a civil war. So the Mujahideen factors start fighting each other. We will pull out, right? At this point, we didn't care who led the country. We just didn't want the Soviets to be leading that country. This is going to cause a whole lot of resentment, right? Bitter resentment by a lot of people in Afghanistan because we had promised them that we'd help them rebuild their country and then we pull out. Okay, bin Laden's going to be one of those people that gets very mad. In the end, an Islamic extremist group known as the Taliban will take control of Afghanistan by 1996. So they have 8 years of civil war. And like I said before, the CIA is funneling weapons mainly through Pakistan to the Mujahideen. Pakistan is giving most of those weapons to Islamic extremists because they were the best fighters, and by the Pakistani government at that time supported more extremist type of behavior. So now when the civil war happens, those extremists are going to take out the moderates. So there won't be any moderates anymore. It's going to be a fight between extremist groups, and eventually one of them, the Taliban, takes control. So the Taliban will take control of the country. They will support any extremist group dedicating to preserving Islam and destroying Western influence in the Middle East. So Afghanistan, in effect, becomes a terrorist training ground, right? So you can see here in 92, a whole bunch of different groups fighting it out. By 1996, the Taliban will control most of the country, right? There will still be fighting forever. This part we call the reddish, we eventually start calling the Northern Alliance, and we're going to try to use them against the Taliban and all sorts of stuff. But that will be after, obviously, 9/11. So we will get to that later. So after Soviets pulled out in 1988, Afghanistan went through a long civil war in which blank came to control the country. Was it A, Al-Qaeda, B, ISIS, C, the Taliban, or D, none of the above? All right, so it brings us to Al-Qaeda. So the Taliban control Afghanistan, so the government. Al-Qaeda is one of the terror groups that will find refuge in Afghanistan. Okay, it was started by Osama bin Laden during the Soviet-Afghan War. Al-Qaeda means the base, and when we translate it, okay, Al-Qaeda's objectives included the elimination of foreign influence in Muslim countries, the eradication of those deemed to be infidels, the elimination of Israel, and the creation of a pure Islamic state. Right? So, they want to get Westerners, they want to get our influence, American, French, British, German, Western influence out of the Middle East. They want to kill infidels. They want to eliminate Israel, right? So there's some of our foreign policy as one of their direct things that they're fighting against, and the creation of their own pure Islamic state. So, Osama and the Taliban now have Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda now have a country to base their operations in because the Taliban support them. Al-Qaeda will set up training facilities for anyone who is willing to fight for their cause. They put out calls for people all over the Middle East to travel to Afghanistan and train. The U.S. knew about it, but we chose not to do anything because we didn't see it really as a threat. And obviously it becomes a pretty big threat. Oh, I just answered this, but anyways, true or false? The U.S. knew that there were terrorist training camps in Afghanistan, but we didn't see them as an immediate threat. Is that true or is that false? All right. Slight backtrack in history, because I was talking about the 96 to 2001 period. The Iran-Iraq War, which we've talked about as well. So this shaded in country is Iraq, and directly to its right is Iran. Okay, so 79 to 80, the Iranian hostage crisis happened. So the new Iranian government will hold Americans hostage for more than a year, eventually releasing them once Ronald Reagan gets elected. September of 1980, Iraq will invade Iran, starting an 8-year war. We and other Western nations will support Iraq and Saddam Hussein against Iran because we did not trust the new Iranian government because it was now a theocracy, an Islamic government. And Iran was close with the Soviet Union. The Soviets are going to support Iran after the Iranian hostage crisis. And so obviously we're going to be set on the other side. We will sell Saddam chemical weapons that he will use against the Iranians. Thousands of Iranians are going to die in chemical weapons attacks, and that is directly linked to us selling chemical weapons, or at least the technology to create chemical weapons, to Saddam Hussein. Later on, in the 90s, Saddam Hussein will use, or try to use, some of those chemical weapons to kill all of the Kurds in the north of Iraq. Okay, so the Kurds are a ethnic group, and Saddam did not like the Kurds, and he's going to try to kill the Kurds with that chemical weapon stuff. During all this, if you remember from the Reagan lecture, we're funneling weapons to Iran in what we call the Iran-Contra affair. So we are arming both sides as they are slaughtering thousands and thousands of each other. Part of the reason why people in the Middle East don't like us, right? We support both sides in a war, and we do that multiple times. On the bottom here, we got Saddam Hussein on the left, and we got the Ayatollah Khomeini, the first Ayatollah after the revolution in Iran. So true or false? The U.S. supported Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. However, we still funneled weapons to Iran at the same time. Is that true or is that false? All right, the Gulf War. So, spoiler alert, the Iran-Iraq War ends in a draw, right? Basically, nothing ends up happening. Both sides are going to claim victory, but in a neutral observer's perspective, it's pretty much a draw. However, Iraq's going to be in huge debt, $14 billion in debt after the failed war with Iran. So the idea was to invade Kuwait. It's a quick fix. We'll take all their oil, sell it, and we'll be out of debt. The U.S. had close connections with Kuwait and Saudi Arabia because of oil. Saudi Arabia will then allow us to station troops in their country if we help eventually free Kuwait, and that's going to be a big, big, big decision. So a bunch of extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda, will offer Saudi Arabia their support. They'll say, hey, we'll send our fighters to Saudi Arabia to help you fight against Saddam, right? He was seen as a Western conspirator because he had been supported by the West, and he also wasn't, there's two big groups of Muslims, Sunni and Shiite, and he will kind of play them against each other, which will make a lot of Muslims angry. So he offers, Osama bin Laden offers the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia their help, right? He says, my Islamic fighters will help you fight. And they say no, because the Saudi government had already made a deal with the United States to have U.S. soldiers and NATO soldiers and UN soldiers on their land, right? That's easier to attack from there and all sorts of whatever strategic decisions. The reason that this is a huge deal is that Saudi Arabia is the holiest country in the Muslim faith. That's where Mecca and that's where Medina are. Okay, every Muslim is supposed to visit Mecca once in their life, so it's a pretty big deal. So a lot of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda will see this as a slap in the face to their religion to allow infidels that close to Mecca and Medina. That will help turn Osama even more against America at this point. So on the right is Medina, on the left is Mecca. Okay, like I said, it's part of the 5 pillars of Islam for every Muslim to visit Mecca at some point in their lives. So Saudi Arabia's decision to allow blank troops to be stationed in their country angered Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. A, U.S., B, UN, C, coalition, or D, Iraqi. All right, back to the Gulf War. The U.S. and allied forces will take back Kuwait very quickly. Only 6 weeks of actual fighting, 5 weeks of bombing, and 100 hours of ground invasion will force the Iraqi military out. However, we allow Saddam to stay in power because the UN goal was to free Kuwait, not oust Saddam, and so we allowed that to happen. Highway of Death, I mentioned before. Some people call it the highway to hell, some call it the highway to death, but as you can see here, there were lots of military personnel, but there also were a lot of civilians fleeing away from Baghdad when the bombing was taking place, and we're going to just shoot them all, kill lots of people, because there were some military vehicles there too. Probably a war crime. All right, events leading up to Al-Qaeda's attacks against the U.S. on 9/11. First big one, in Aden, Yemen. 3 hotels are bombed that housed U.S. troops. Okay, 2 are going to die, and 7 will be wounded. Okay, that's in Yemen, which I talked to you about earlier on that map. Okay, that's in 1992. 1993, the Black Hawk Down incident, which we touched on during the Clinton lecture. 2 U.S. helicopters are shot down by Somali militiamen loyal to Mohammed Farah Aidid. This is part of the Somali Civil War. Somalia has been through a lot. So this event starts a 2-day-long battle in the streets of Mogadishu between U.S. troops and Somali militiamen. 18 U.S. troops will die, 73 will be wounded. Somewhere between 200 and 315 Somalis and militiamen and civilians will die. The very next day when this battle is over, the United States and the UN will pull all their troops out of Somalia, and it will descend further into chaos and civil war. 93, the World Trade Center bombing attempt. 5 will die. We talked about that a lot under Clinton. They filled up a van full of explosives and parked it underneath the World Trade Center and tried to blow it up and make it collapse. It did not. However, 5 will die. Embassy bombings. We talked about this under Clinton as well. In 1998, there were bombings at 2 U.S. embassies, one in Nairobi, Kenya, one in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. More than 200 people will die. More than 5,000 will be injured. Then we have the USS Cole bombing, which again is in Yemen off of the coast of Aden. 17 will die and 39 will be injured when a couple of Al-Qaeda operatives will just drive their boat up to the side of our warship and run into it and blow it up. There's a show called The Looming Tower on Hulu that has a really great representation of this, but it's kind of insane, right? They were waving to the people and then this happens, right? We will respond, okay, by doing a few things. The FBI, CIA, and State Department all launched their own investigations into the embassy and USS Cole attacks. However, political infighting, animosity, and poor leadership will lead them all not to share information with each other. So we had 3 separate investigations going on, and they didn't share any information with each other. Had they done that, 9/11 probably would not have happened. At the same time, we're going to send missiles. We're going to shoot missiles off of this ship right here into Afghanistan to try to blow up Al-Qaeda training sites. That'll be ineffective. But it will cause international incidents because we're not supposed to shoot missiles over other countries without telling them. We will kill innocent people in Afghanistan as well when we miss some of our targets. So, Al-Qaeda attacked U.S. troops or embassy workers in 3 of these countries. Which 3 of them were they? A, Yemen, B, Kenya, C, Tanzania, D, Iraq, or E, Saudi Arabia. So, this all leads to September 11th, to 9/11, right? Al-Qaeda succeeds in their attack against the United States. 4 commercial planes that are hijacked by Al-Qaeda sleeper cells. 2 of them hit the World Trade Center in New York. American Airlines Flight 11 hit the North Tower. United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower, and 2 more planes will be hijacked shortly thereafter. Okay, another American Airlines Flight number 77 will hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. United Airlines, the Hero Flight 93, the passengers rebel and they attack the hijackers and the plane crashes in a field in Pennsylvania. We believe that last flight was heading to the White House. 19 hijackers and 2,996 Americans will die on 9/11.